Hello, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. So I'm going to be introducing our speaker today. Dr. Rzeszutek is a postdoctoral scholar in the Healthier Futures Lab in the University of Kentucky. He completed a BA in Comprehensive Psychology from Wilfrid Laurier University and MS in Applied Behavior Analysis from St. Cloud State University, and a PhD in Psychology from Western Michigan University. His current research focuses on methodologies in the quantitative analysis of behavior and using behavioral economics to better understand the relationship between alcohol and suicidal thoughts and behaviors, and is actually the recent recipient of a grant to study that very thing he just found out, so congratulations. And so I'll go ahead and, he's going to go ahead and get started to talk about integrating discounting and demand, finding a common language between behavioral economic frameworks and modeling strategies. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raiff. Gotta get my water bottle. Okay, so thank you very much. First things first, some acknowledgements and disclosures. Thank the funding that allows me to eat food, buy food, and have shelter, roof over my head. So I have some funding support through the NIH that was awarded to Dr. Cofferness. Opinions that I'm talking about here are solely my own. Hi Mom, hi Dad, hi my brothers and aunt and uncle and everybody and all the friends who helped me get here and all the friends that I made along the way. And then also big thanks to SQAB and ABAI for letting me talk. I'm going to go over what we're not going to cover at least not in great detail. I'm not going to go over any sort of detailed statistical considerations. I'm not going to talk about issues of mathematical versus statistical equivalency, which model is the right quote-unquote model, considerations for preference reversals, which is important in discounting, sort of cross-commodity demand and discounting, or any sort of area or volumetric or tesseract real measures that are sort of without function that can be used for discounting demand. So what we will cover are conceptual and mathematical models of behavior, discounting, so what is it? What are some of the models that are used in it, what each parameter of those models actually means, and then how to mix and match models so we get more complex understandings and descriptions of behavior. I'm going to talk about demand, so what is it, some of the models that are used for demand, and what each parameter in a demand equation means, and then really understanding what the normalized decay parameter means in the context of demand metrics. Then we'll do deriving some discounting and demand metrics for different models. Finally, we're going to compare some of these parameter estimates for our quote-unquote discounting equations and demand equations. And then some additional considerations when you're doing any mathy stuff to begin with. So, who is this for? It's for you smart and handsome devils. It's for people who wanted to get a start with discounting and demand but never knew how. And it's also for people who are experienced with discounting and demand but want to extend their quantitative methods further. And people who are afraid of 7. There will be payoff for this in the end, trust me. And at the end of this, I hope that you can create tables as obnoxious and large as this, where you have 18 different equations in there, and you're like, who would ever do something like that? Who creates this type of table? It was me. So this might be trite, but I like thinking about all the stuff we do. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And so another model that I find particularly useful is to dance like nobody's watching. And sometimes live, laugh, love is the model I go by. But I'm also going to go by the model of, if I have a nice serene background, the text in front of it must be true. So there are no discounting or demand equations, just equations that are used in discounting and demand. So let's first go over conceptual models. So we all use conceptual models. And the sort of most common one that we might use in a behavior analysis convention would be the 4-term contingency. So motivating operations, antecedents, behavior consequences. You might use a model like J.R. Cantor's model of the psychological event. And then you would have a conceptual definition of what discounting is. So an organism will change their allocation between choices as a function of delay, probability, social distance, etc. And then you might have a conceptual model of demand, where consumption will systematically decrease as a function of cost increasing. But then we have mathematical models. And so even with this conceptual model that we use in the 4-term contingency, there's an implicit mathematical model that we use to determine whether or not something's reinforcing. So if the behavior post a consequence is greater than the behavior before the consequence, we think that consequence is reinforcing. And so regardless of what we do, we want to make sure that our conceptual models line up with our mathematical models. Because if you have a mathematical model, you can fit anything to any data that you want, but if it doesn't, if what you're modeling doesn't fit with the conceptual model of what's important and interesting to you, it's not worth it. So another important consideration is that everything is just behavior. We are responding to stimuli that happen to be based on mathematical equations, which are sets of rules which were created by other behaving organisms. So what we're trying to do when we're modeling, whether it be discounting, demand, anything else, we want to look at something really simple. So it might be, would you rather, in the case of discounting, or like in the case of demand, would you purchase and consume? We want to narrow down one specific thing. But the reality is, there is a lot of moving parts in every organism, right? There's lots of history, current like state versus trade versus all that kind of stuff. So what I am hoping to accomplish today is we're looking at this very simple thing, but then being able to create models that help account for more aspects that might affect choices and decision making. So first, I'm going to go over discounting. The most common thing that I'm assuming most of us are familiar with is delayed discounting. So the archetypal, would you rather a smaller amount now versus a larger amount later? So on the screen is going to be on the Y or vertical axis are going to be the indifference points, and on the X or horizontal axis are delays. So when you have an immediate choice now, a smaller immediate choice now versus a larger immediate choice now, organisms will generally pick the larger choice if it has the same delay as the smaller choice. But as the delay to the larger choice increases, the amount of the smaller choice, the relative amount, choices can switch from the larger later amount to the smaller sooner amount. And so in this case, you know, an organism or individual might switch from picking the larger later 1,000 at about a year, and rather take $750 now. And then as you continue on, the more delayed the larger later becomes, the less it takes to shift behavior to choose the smaller sooner. And we just keep going, keep drawing out this little curve. Neat. So now I'm going to give you an example of steep discounting. So when you have the choice between, you know, larger immediate option and smaller immediate option, it makes sense that the smaller immediate option is still going to be selected. However, once any delay is added to this larger later, the relative amount it takes to switch over is much less than in the previous example. So it's only, you know, in the previous one, I would need $750 now to be equal to $1,000 in a year. But in this case, it would only be like $300 now instead of $1,000 a year. And so steep discounting is only in relation to something else. Everything, if it's steep, if it's shallow, it's all in relation to some other curve. So on the flip side would be shallow discounting. So we start off with the same, but then the smaller sooner amount required to be equivalent to the larger later is much closer in value to the larger later. So this is shallow discounting. And so basically the only thing with steep discounting and shallow discounting, they kind of describe the preference for the larger later or smaller sooner. So if an individual has shallow discounting, that's a general preference or a series of repeated choices towards the larger later option, relatively speaking, versus steep discounting, which indicates a preference for the smaller sooner reward. So there's other types of discounting too. So there's effort discounting. So would you rather $100 for one push-up, or would you rather $1,000 for 1,000 push-ups? And then so you can systematically affect the sort of effort as the independent variable that you're assessing on how that affects choices between two options. There's also social discounting. So, you know, would you rather $100 for yourself or $1,000 for a stranger? And then you can, you know, vary the relative social, you know, quote unquote social distance of somebody and determine when you switch from giving somebody else money to taking for yourself. And then there's what I'm going to coin as parasocial discounting. So would you rather give Taylor Swift $1,000 so she can emit 1,200 times the emissions of the average person, or give $10 to literally anybody else? Or something that happened to me with the sort of cross-commodity discounting, where it was, do you sign up for Bonvoy or pay $16 a day for internet? I signed up for Bonvoy, couldn't get the internet working, so I just used the hotspot on my phone. So I just ignored these two options and created my own. So now we're going to talk about modeling discounting. So there's lots of different discounting models. I'm going to cover a couple popular ones, but this is by no means exhaustive, and by no means does this mean that these models are quote-unquote the correct models. So one of the first models that tried to describe how the effect of delay could impact decision-making or the value of a commodity was the 1937 discounted utility function by Samuelson. Then there was the hyperbolic model that was validated by Mazur in 1987, and this is probably the model we've most seen and are familiar with. And then there's the hyperboloid. There's different versions of the hyperboloid. I'm not going to say which one is or isn't better. This is the Racklin hyperboloid, and I'm just going to talk about it a little bit, or use it as an example for another model that exists for discounting. So I'm going to go to the anatomy of a discounting equation, because I want to be really clear about what is happening, because if you see what's happening within an equation, it's going to be a lot easier to then transfer stuff with discounting to demand and then integrate it all together. So here we have the Mazur hyperbola, and I'm going to go through every little parameter, and we're going to see what everything does. So the V is the same as the response, or the behavioral proxy being measured. It's the dependent variable, it's the Y. The X is the independent variable, so this is the variable under which you care about how behavior is affected. This is the decay parameter, and that's used to describe the behavior of interest. And then there's the intercept, sort of the maximum point of the line, or in discounting, it's usually the quote-unquote objective value of the larger outcome, and it can either be fixed or treated as a free parameter. And this one, why is it there? Well, it's super handy to make it so you don't divide by zero, because if you divide by zero, it's the same as trying to like move a table in a Word document. All of a sudden, your siren's in the distance, everything's broken, your formatting of the Word table's all messed up, and then your grant submission is not going to be feasible because you're busy trying to format things. Anyways, so this little surrounded term is what is responsible for the decrease from A, or the intercept. And kind of turning things into more plain language, you can look at the previous equation as the dependent variable is equal to the intercept divided by all of 1 plus decay times the independent variable. So let's do the same thing for the Samuelson equation, or the simple exponential model. So we have the amount, which again is the exact same thing as in the previous model, as the intercept. We have the decay parameter, and then we have Euler's number, which it's really handy and it's used in like compound interest, and it's the base of the exponent, but it doesn't actually need to be E, which is about like 2.7-ish. You can use different numbers for bases, unless it's 1, and then it'll always be 1, and then you just don't use 1 as base, because then you'll only have 1s. But yeah, it doesn't need to be Euler's number, but it's very handy with a lot of math, because that's why it's used. And so now, this part of the equation is what is responsible for the decrease in A when we are modeling behavior. But, in sort of plain language again, the dependent variable is, for the Samuelson or the discounted utility model, the dependent variable is equal to the intercept times Euler's number to the power of negative decay times the independent variable. And so this is really it. When in doubt, plot it out. So I'm going to say this more than once, but everything that we're going to do is like, if you're ever curious about what something does, plot it out. You should probably just plot things out generally, but let's do that. Let's plot it out. Let's see the difference between the hyperbolic and the exponential discounting. and compare and contrast. So this is an example of two very steep discounting curves for both the hyperbolic and exponential function. The hyperbolic is the orange and the exponential is blue. When it's the decay parameter decreases, it's less steep, and I'm doing this on purpose and being why this is really hard to read, and that's the point, because I'm going to show you how to fix that too. And then as the decay parameter increases again, the curve starts to become more shallow. But this is the importance why we should log scale the independent variable, not transform it, that's different, but at least for visualization purposes, log scaling is useful to help see how some of these equations look and perform. So I'm going to show you the exact same curves with the same parameters, but now using a log scale on the x-axis. So here it's a lot easier to see how the hyperbola in the orange is different than the exponential function in the blue. The exponential function curves down a little sooner, and the hyperbola has a little smoother end. And when we change the decay parameter, the shape remains the same, it's just a rightward shift. We decrease the decay parameter further, it's just a rightward shift. And now it's like a little wave. But so it's a lot easier to see when you have log scaled x-axis to see what's going on. And now, let's see what happens. What is the effect of a scaling parameter? So we're going to go back to that Racklin hyperboloid. And now we're going to look at this S parameter. So it's a sensitivity parameter that makes the curve fun and bendier. And now, so this, in the hyperboloid, this is what determines the decrease as a function of x, decrease of the intercept as a function of the independent variable. And in plain language, the dependent variable is equal to the intercept all over 1 plus the decay parameter times the independent variable to the scaling or sensitivity parameter. And so this is what it looks like when you have different s's and just the same decay parameter. Note that in the hyperboloids, for discounting, the s, when s is equal to 1, it is just a regular hyperbola, so it's the same as the Mazur 1987 model. When s is less than 0.5, the slope it's much more shallow, and when s is greater than 1, it's a much steeper curve, and it kind of resembles a little bit more like the exponential function. But when you move the decay parameter, so if we decrease the decay parameter, there's the same rightward shift, but there's no longer the consistent change as a function of that scaling or sensitivity parameter. And this is even clearer when we go even further. So you can still have the fun little wave, but the only thing that has the same shape as the decay parameter changes is the single parameter model for Mazur's hyperbola. So there's also a helpful derived metric for this, because when you start having multiple parameters, they become correlated with each other. Trying to interpret them independently can have there's considerations for that I'm not going to go into detail with. But a helpful metric that you can use to have a single thing to describe a demand curve, or a discounting curve, rather, is the, I'm calling it EX50, normally it's ED50 for delay, but just like the effective point at which the curve is 50% of its larger amount's initial value, or the point at which the curve crosses 50% of the intercept. But the mathematical definition for this is solve for x when the intercept, or rather the y is equal to the intercept divided by 2, or the intercept times 0.5. And so here's what this looks like. So for the Samuelson, or the discounting utility function, that's log 2, natural log 2 over the decay parameter. For the Mazur's hyperbola, it's 1 over the decay parameter. And for the Racklin hyperboloid, it is 1 over the decay parameter to the root of the scaling parameter. And here's some other helpful tricks. I'm really lazy, so when I don't want to do things by hand, Wolfram Alpha is super handy. It's been around, I believe, since like 2006. So if you are ever trying to do something really quickly and you don't want to sit there doing it by hand, you can kind of do relatively plain language into Wolfram Alpha, and it'll spit out the results. Obviously, when in doubt, plot it out before you assume everything is correct. But there's also a handy trick that I also learned recently, like a year ago, is that something to the power of -1 is equal to 1 over that thing. So e to the power of -1 is equal to 1 over e. And why do I bring this up? So here's that discounted utility function again. So it's handy to see what we can use and manipulate to make things easier to merge with other equations. So these, the a times e to the power of -b times x is the same as a all over e to the power of b times x. So if we want to mix and match, let's say the exponential function and the hyperbolic model, this is the same as this, is the same as that. So let's get into a little personal way that we can determine my likelihood to allocate responding to running. So alternately titled Run, Mark, Run. I hate running. I'm not a fan. If I can avoid it, I will. I think I threw up in my mouth a little bit just thinking about going for a run. But if you're at a run club and there's beer and friends, well, my likelihood to allocate time to running changes. But I also hate running in the rain. So any risk of rain makes me really not want to run either. So let's create a little discounting model of my likelihood to engage in running or not running. So we have the likelihood of me running is equal to, I did 100 for the intercept just to assume that there is a mathematical I would always run, times, we're assuming an exponential function for the odds of rain. So as the odds of rain increases, my likelihood to run decreases, times the decay of odds against beer. So as the likelihood of beer decreases, my likelihood to run also decreases, and then odds against friends. So as the odds against people I like showing up to run club decreases, then my likelihood to run also decreases. And now we can have a nice little three-dimensional model where we're modeling more than just one or two things. This is actually going to work out to be four-dimensional, and I'll show you why in a second. So this is my likelihood to run when the odds against beer are extremely low. Like maybe there's like a chance that the bar explodes right as we're on a run and whatever, you know, or as I'm driving to run club and I'm like, no, never again. So as the odds of rain increase, my likelihood to run decreases. As the odds against friends, so there's less likelihood of friends showing up, increases, my likelihood to run decreases. But otherwise, if beer's available, then my likelihood to run is basically like 90-ish%. But what happens when it's equal 50-50 chance of there being beer? My likelihood to run, my likelihood to allocate to running decreases. So let's talk about some alternative models. I originally got into Warhammer. Oh wait, that's not the type of models we're supposed to be talking about, right? But it's kind of useful that I did this as a segue that I planned, obviously, is these little models, the hobbyist thing. So these are pretty addicting, which is going to be relevant because the thing I'm going to talk about next is typically used in the study of addictive substances and can be used for much else, but demand. So let's talk about demand. So on the y-axis here, we're going to have the number of little small toy soldiers purchased for me, and on the x-axis is the cost to purchase these individual toy soldiers. So the cost to purchase is already logarithmically scaled, just so everything is going to be logarithmically scaled on the x-axis, continuing onwards. But, so let's say if these models cost me $1, I would buy 4 of them because that's all I need. They cost $10, I would buy 4 of them because that's all I need and all I want. They cost $100 though, and I'm not saying I already did this, but yeah, I would buy 3. But what if it's like $1,000? How much do I really want it? But as the cost increases, my purchasing, the number I would purchase decreases. And again, much like discounting, there's going to be that consideration of, instead of shallow demand, we would talk about price sensitivity. So if we have somebody that is price sensitive to buying little toy soldiers, when they're cheap, they might be like, yeah, I'll buy 4, that's cool. But then it was like $10 instead of still buying 4, maybe 2. Is $100 like 1? Maybe it's because it's just like, I really like the model and I think it's cool. And then, if it's 1,000, absolutely not. 10,000, 100,000, absolutely not. So, and then there's price insensitive, which is absolutely not me, obviously, to these. So, you start at high, but then as price increases, the relative consumption is much more stable. And I'm not saying I have a problem, you have the problem, you're the problem, not me. Anyways, how do we model demand? So there's a lot of different demand equations that you can use. I'm going to cover a couple popular ones, but really focus on one. And so there's the Hirsch-Silverberg model 2008 of demand, the exponential model of demand. There is the exponentiated model of demand, which is Kaufman's et al. 2015, which is just an exponentiation of the 2008 model. And then there's alternative models that have additional complexity. So this is the Newman-Ferrario model from 2020. But I would like to note that the exponential model of demand and the exponential model of demand are mathematically equivalent models. So because of this, and because all the discounting functions we talked about did not have logarithmic scaling on the dependent variable, or logarithmic transform on the dependent variable, I am just going to focus on the exponentiated function. So let's, anatomy of an equation. Let's dissect this. So Q, which is typically consumption, is also the same as the Y, the behavioral proxy being modeled, or the dependent variable, which in demand is typically consumption. You have the intercept, which is the maximum point of a line, or consumption at zero cost, but this is the intercept. Then you have this K, which is a span parameter, which I'm not going to go into detail on, but basically it determines the lower limit of the curve. You have this alpha, which is the decay parameter, which is normalized by the intercept. You have the inherent variable x, which could be cost, effort, time, whatever you want it to be. You have this -1, and it exists to basically bring down the equation. So Q0 is sort of where you want it to be because the addition of the span parameter bumps it up. I recommend, again, if you're curious about something, play with it. Add and remove it from the model and see how it affects the curve. And then this is the 10 is the base of the first exponent, and then Euler's number is the base of the second exponent. But then you see the second thing, and you're like, this intercept showed up again? That's different, right? What's up with that? That wasn't in the discounting things. What does this do? But so we're going to do plain language. What do these things mean? So it's the dependent variable is equal to the intercept times 10 to the power of the span parameter, and then all multiplied through the e to the power of minus decay times the intercept times the independent variable, and then that is -1. So that -1 is not in that exponent, but it is in the parentheses. So let's talk about some demand metrics that are useful, because I said a lot of words, and it's like, what are these all about? Who really cares about what from these models that we could care about, at least conceptually anyways. So the one I'm going to focus on is going to be Omax, and then as a result of that, Emax. So the conceptual definition of Omax is the maximum output or expenditure, which is cost times consumption. But the mathematical definition to actually solve for this is when the slope of the function of x times y is equal to 0. So let's, using my model purchasing as an expenditure curve, on the y-axis now is expenditure. So expenditure is cost of the commodity times the amount of the commodity that you consumed and purchased. So if I was to buy 4 models at $1, that's $4. If I was to buy 4 models at $10, that's $40. If I was to buy 4 at 100, that's $400. If I was to buy 1 at 1,000, that's $1,000. And if I paid by 0 at the other amounts, well, that expenditure is going to logically be 0. And so we have the Omax, which is the maximum expenditure that you would use for or do for a commodity, and the Pmax, which is the point of maximum expenditure. So Pmax is going to be related to the x-axis, Omax is going to be related to the y-axis. So let's look at what the expenditure equation is. So expenditure, or output, is equal to the independent variable times consumption at 0 times 10 to the span So it's basically, all you're doing is you're multiplying that whole consumption equation by x again. But when in doubt, blot it out. So let's look at this normalized decay and expenditure to really see what this parameter in the model is doing. So here we're going to have fixed intercept, so consumption at 0 is going to remain the same, but the decay parameter is going to shift, or going to change. So here, when k is fixed, always, if you're within an analysis, make sure k is fixed. This is important. I'm not going to get into details about it, but k fixed within analysis. But when the decay parameter decreases, there's a rightward shift of consumption. So it's exactly the same thing that was happening with discounting, where when the decay parameter decreased, there was a rightward shift of discounting, so it's shallower discounting. What happens when we have the same fixed intercept, but doing it for expenditures? We're only changing alpha. So what happens here is we can see this peak mathematical definition of where the slope of this curve is 0 for these Omaxes. So as alpha, or the decay parameter, decreases, Omax increases, and so alpha, or the decay parameter, when the consumption at 0 is fixed, there is a direct relationship between the decay parameter, Omax, and Pmax. But you also might be noticing, what's with this weird tail end going up? This is because of K. So the span parameter sets a lower limit to the curve, which means that it will hit a minimum, so it will never hit 0, or it'll never infinitely continue approaching 0. So there's going to be a lower limit, which, let's say if the lower limit is 0.1, eventually, when you do 0.1 times 10 times 100 times so on and so forth, the expenditure curve will go back up again. This is just a consideration for the model that you're using, and knowing what K does, what alpha does, what Q0 does. And this is why I'm always saying, when in doubt, plot it out. So let's look what happens when we have fixed decay but consumption changes. So when you look at the consumption curves, we change the intercept, and so the height of the curve changes, which is very unsurprising. But what happens when we have this fixed decay on expenditure? So the alpha value is going to remain the same, but using this normalized equation. So when alpha is fixed, and in this particular equation, K also has to be fixed, and you just change the consumption at 0, what ends up happening is Omax, maximum expenditure, is perfectly related to alpha, because when alpha does not change, the decay parameter does not change in this equation, maximum expenditure does not change in this equation. But when you change the consumption at 0, the Pmax changes. So as you increase consumption at 0, there's a leftward shift of Pmax. So what about non-normalized? How does this look? And let's see what happens. So we're going to basically take the sort of Hirsch or Silverberg framework, and instead of having that second intercept up in there, we're just going to remove it. And we're going to plot the same curves, see what happens. So we have a fixed intercept consumption, so this is where the decay parameter is going to move around. So it looks very similar to what we just saw when the intercept doesn't change, and we just change the decay parameter. When decay decreases, there's the rightward shift of consumption. When we have a fixed intercept and look at expenditure for non-normalized equation, it's the exact same pattern we saw before, where there is a relationship between the decay parameter decreasing and Omax increasing. And then, so Pmax in this case is related to Omax, where that's happening because of that rightward shift. But what happens when we look at the fixed decay and having for consumption, so now the intercept or consumption at 0 is going to change. And so here we have, it looks kind of similar to the one that's normalized, but there is, you might note, that there's like the little crossover that happened at the bottom right of the figure isn't happening with these curves. But it's going to be a lot clearer to see exactly what's going on when we look at the expenditure curve. So if we have a fixed decay, so it's going to be the same, alpha is going to be the same value, but we have the consumption 0 change, what occurs instead is when it's not normalized, the Omax, maximum expenditure, is going to be related to consumption at 0, while alpha is, or the decay parameter, is going to be directly related to Pmax. So putting the two side by side, on the left-hand side is the normalized equation, and this, when alpha is fixed, and other things change, Omax, when alpha is fixed, Omax remains the same when it's normalized. But when it's not normalized, alpha is related to Pmax instead of Omax. So again, that's just what these equations are doing. So how are we going to put this all together? How are we going to connect all the dots? Well, there's normalized decay for the demand equations. We can have a hyperbola with normalized decay. Let's see what that does. So I'm going to take the regular hyperbola, we already saw this one before, turn it into a demand equation, quote unquote, throw in that extra intercept next to the decay parameter, and then do expenditure. And I'm just going to focus on expenditure for time and convenience. But so we have this hyperbolic normalized expenditure curve. And if you'll note, this expenditure curve doesn't go down. Instead, there's a leveling off. So as you change the decay for a hyperbola and try to do expenditure from it, you don't get a sort of mathematical peak of zero, or a peak where the slope is zero. Instead, you get an asymptote. But when you have the normalized hyperbolic equation, and you have the decay parameter fixed, but you vary consumption at zero, you get that same leftward shift that happened with the normalized demand functions. And just to continue demonstrating what will happen, we're going to do the same thing with the non-normalized decay thing. So this is just going to be the sort of quote-unquote regular hyperbola we saw earlier. So when you have expenditure and you change the decay, when you decrease decay, it increases the asymptote of the expenditure. But when you have it not normalized and then you have the decay parameter fixed and you change the consumption at zero, instead what happens is, like with the previous example for the exponentiated function, when it's not normalized, the consumption at zero is affecting expenditure. Let's do the same with the simple exponential and normalized decay. So we have the discounted utility function, we demandify it, and then throw that normalization in there and look at expenditure. So here's what the simple exponential function looks like when you add that normalization function in there. So when consumption at zero is fixed, but we only vary the decay parameter, what happens is as decrease in decay is an increase in expenditure. When you have the fixed decay parameter and you vary consumption at zero, we see that same leftward shift for Pmaxes, but Omaxes are consistent across these things so long as the decay parameter is fixed in the normalized version. And just again, case in point, when we have it non-normalized, the same pattern of when the decay parameter decreases, expenditure increases. When we make it non-normalized, there is now the maximum expenditure is determined by changes in the consumption at zero when the decay parameter is fixed. And so I'm just going to do the hyperboloid with non-normalized decay. I'm not going to normalize it because of the whether or not it's worth it given the multiple parameters and all that kind of stuff. And this is a discussion I'm willing to have with somebody at a bar over. But for this, I'm just going to show you what happens with expenditure and that, flippy little sensitivity scaling parameter. So I just took that Raiff hyperboloid, demandified it, and then did expenditure. So when S is equal to 1, it performs the exact same way as the regular hyperbola because we already saw how that works, where it has an asymptote. But when S is greater than 1, there is actually a mathematical point at which the expenditure curve has a slope of 0. There's a proper peak and a proper Pmax. However, if S is less than 1, it will scream into infinity and beyond. So, we're looking at everything and trying to figure out what equations can produce what metrics we care about. And just remember, nothing is in a vacuum. So an example that is maybe more related to y'all than Warhammer and little toy soldiers is on the y-axis, drinks purchased, and on the x-axis, cost of purchase. So maybe on a regular day, you might be like, I would maybe have about 3 drinks, and then if it was to cost me $10 per drink, I'd only have 2, and then you're not going to spend exorbitant amounts on alcohol. But what if we have to pay the ABAI tax, and now we're here, and I mean, like, none of us would do it, obviously, but all of a sudden, our alcohol consumption increases drastically. Obviously, we're still not going to buy ridiculously priced alcohol, but, the context matters what we're doing. But then, and kind of the whole reason I started to get into this mess was, but what if the bar is busy and the time to get drinks is delayed? So how do you model consumption when more than one factor could be affecting it, especially if the functional form, you don't know which is the functional form, rather than just assuming everything is one thing. So, you just throw it all together. Is it just remembering what is the intercept, what describes the decrease from that, and so this is a sort of discounting version, but then you can have demand version. So it's really just caring about, are your parameter estimates normalized or not? And if you want a consistent interpretation between these things, make sure to either normalize all your decay parameters or not normalize your decay parameters, so at least it's consistent within your analysis. And then, there's the big thing, is it discounting, is it demand, it's all one or the other, like it's fine, it doesn't matter. It's all about understanding what you're modeling and why, in my opinion. I don't know what my opinion is, what I meant. So, you just look at it as the dependent variable is equal to the intercept times your decay parameter for one thing or the other thing. There are other considerations, like you can have additive versus multiplicative functions. Not going to get into that, but you can. So what we can do is, rather than say it is one thing or the other, this equation should always be used for this or that, we can just look at what equations can produce the relevant demand or discounting metrics that we want. So with the hyperbola, normalized and non-normalized, we can find the effective point at the decrease of 50%, EX50. You can technically find Pmax, but you can actually calculate the asymptote if you really wanted to. For the simplified, or the simple exponential function, or the Samuelson one, you can find all these three parameters with no issue. If you want, you can also find, with a little bit more, there was Dr. Gilroy had done really good work at solving the how to find Pmax and Omax for the exponentiated and exponential demand functions in the Hirsch-Silverberg framework. But one of the considerations is, because K affects the sort of, it's the span parameter, so it affects the top and the bottom, or the bottom of the curve. So if the K parameter is not large enough, there is no mathematical solution for some of these metrics. So that's a consideration to make with whatever model you're using. But, and then with the rapid and hyperboloid, you can calculate all these things, but again, there's a consideration of, if the scaling parameter is 1 or less or lower, then you can't actually calculate some of these relevant metrics. So that's just a consideration you need to do if you want to use that particular equation. And you might be asking, like I asked and am asking right now, how do these models compare? So these models are all describing decreases from an intercept, right? They're all kind of look similar. There is the simple exponential, there's the exponentiated, and there's the hyperbolic in here. So they're all one parameter models because it's just easier for right now for this. But how do fitting these things to actual data, how do their parameter estimates compare? Because you probably wouldn't expect the hyperbolic functions to produce highly correlated parameter estimates to exponential functions. Or do you? So here are the comparisons with the intercept. This is wildly unsurprising. I'm showing it for posterity. But so on the top left quadrant is the sort of normalized parameter estimates for decay. For the exponentiated, the hyperbolic, and the simple non-normalized versions. And on the bottom right quadrant is going to be the exponentiated normalized, hyperbolic normalized, and simple exponential normalized. And these are all finding the intercept, so this is unsurprising. They should all be very highly correlated. But when we look at the decay comparisons, in the top left, when all the equations we're using are not normalized, the decay parameters were surprisingly correlated, despite the fact, especially I was surprised, why is the hyperbolic one so closely correlated with the other ones? And this is with some publicly available data. Also, I should have said it earlier, but I'm planning on posting the code I used for all this, on my ResearchGate. Just so if you don't agree with me and you don't believe me, then I'll give you the code. You can get it, it's fine. But yeah, and so when it's not normalized, the decay parameter estimates were highly correlated. When they were normalized, they were highly correlated with each other. But the normalized versus non-normalized decay parameter estimates were not particularly correlated with each other, which also makes sense because you have the additional influence of the consumption at zero, the extra intercept next to the decay term that would be affecting how these parameters would be related to each other. So, some additional considerations. There are a lot of curve fitting methods. You can do a lot of different things. There's lots of different ways you can do statistics on stuff. I'm not going to be giving an answer for what's the right thing to do. In the analysis that I just showed, it was using multi-level modeling, so that's a consideration. If you do two-stage modeling, you fit the mean, all this other kind of stuff, things might be different, and that's, again, it's a thing of like just understanding what are the models doing or doing it. When you have multiple parameters, you might get better fits, but then you risk things like overfitting, which is an important consideration because, like, again, is your conceptual model and mathematical model, do they line up in the ways that you would hope they do? And then, because we're going to be, what's the functional form underlying, if any, of the data? We can fit curves to stuff, and they kind of generally fit well. But whether or not that is the appropriate functional form of the data is a separate question that I cannot answer at this time. Nor would I want to, because that seems very difficult. But again, when in doubt, plot it out. If you're ever curious about some math equation, some discounting, demand, whatever equation, plot it out, mess around with the parameters, take away some of the things. So like if you're curious, like what does that -1 or +1 do in a model? Take it out, plot it again, see what happens. And again, we want to make sure that our conceptual models are always aligned with our mathematical models. Because we want to do our best to take something simple, but also account for all these additional variables that could be affecting decision making, and doing our best to model and understand behavior. So, hopefully I've unified discounting and demand, but for those people who are afraid of 7, hopefully there's no more reason to fear 7, even though 7, 8, 9. Question. Thank you.